Professor Jack Goldstone, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Throughout your career, you have explored how demographic pressures, elite fragmentation, and structural crises shape political transformation. In today's world, marked by democratic erosion, rising authoritarianism, populist polarization, and a weakening rule-based order, how would you define this historical moment? Are we in a phase of democratic recalibration, a descent into authoritarian consolidation, or the early stirrings of a new revolutionary epoch? And what do these trajectories mean for the future of human rights, freedom, and global democracy?
Well, as a theme I will come back to during several of your questions, I'd say the answer is both, not either or. That is, yes, we are in a kind of descent into an authoritarian pattern across much of the world, but that's also the beginning of a revolutionary movement. So revolutions are long processes. What I think we are seeing is a situation in which the global and national political institutions of the last 50 years are falling apart. They've come under strain for decades. They're now being picked apart by both elite groups looking for advantage and populations that are deeply dissatisfied with what has happened in terms of global financial crises, difficulties and opportunities for economic growth and social mobility, cultural clashes, global immigration. So all of these pressures have, I think, overwhelmed both mainstream political parties and even the kind of post-World War II liberal consensus institutions. Now, it's therefore the beginning of a revolutionary movement. It's taking the form of a rejection of democracies, which are increasingly seen as corrupt, self-serving, ineffective for ordinary citizens. Where that ends remains to be seen. Revolutions are long processes. We may go through a decade of authoritarian consolidation, but then that may turn around. I think in the long term, the world is going to move toward democracy. That's the outcome that's consistent with growing education and growing demands for autonomy. But before we get there, we may go through a period of authoritarian distress, not unlike the 1930s. I hope no wars on the scale of the 1940s, but we're already seeing wars that are larger than any had since that date. So I do fear that we're going to go through authoritarianism and war, but on the other side of that, there's a good chance to emerge on a new path toward more democracy and prosperity, just as happened after World War II.
Right. In some of your recent articles, you argue that democratic breakdowns and the re-emergence of dictatorships have reignited revolutionary cycles. How do you interpret this paradox in an era where regimes such as those in Russia, Turkey, and China appear to have mastered a new technique, digital surveillance, managed populism, and algorithmic governance, to preempt revolt and consolidate authoritarian rule?
I'll simply say that regimes always have appeared stronger than they really are. Before the Arab Spring, there was a widespread conviction among Middle East specialists that the Middle East autocracies were stable, that they were entrenched, and that this was a domain that was just given over or tending to autocratic government. People forgot that the Middle East had been convulsed by revolutions in the 50s and 60s. But because from the 1980s to the early 2000s, you had stable dictatorships that lasted for decades, a lot of observers thought that these were simply, they'd found some key to survival. It wasn't true. The same thing for the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They had headed off multiple uprisings in Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia during the 1950s and 1960s. And so in the 1970s, when Gorbachev said, you know, we're not doing that well economically. Our consumer sector is terrible. Our industries are falling behind. We need some reforms. Nobody thought that that would mean the total collapse of communism within the decade. But again, a lot of regimes, a lot of autocratic regimes appear stronger than they really are. They may be strong but brittle. And I think that's because politics at the end of the day is driven by one of two emotions, fear or anger. If people are fearful that the government will come after them if they protest, then protest is going to be submerged. That's how authoritarian regimes last for decades. At the same time, if people get sufficiently angry, if they feel that the government is showing signs of weakness, that this is a time when popular anger can be effective, people are surprisingly courageous. The crowds that went into the streets in Moscow and Leipzig had no assurance that they wouldn't be met by force, but they felt this was a time of mass discontent, and if people acted together, they would prevail. Same thing in Cairo, in Tahrir Square. So again, yes, there is new digital surveillance. Yes, regimes look tough, but if people really feel a need to challenge their government, they will do so, because the digital surveillance is just kind of an incremental gain. Regimes have been targeting, imprisoning, and torturing dissidents for decades. China was just as rough on opposition leaders after Tiananmen Square as it is today. So I don't think we can say, oh, we've entered a new domain that makes dictators far more powerful. Dictators do have additional technologies to draw on, but I don't think they change the game for good. I think they're simply the latest round in the competition between governments and people that's been going on for centuries.
Right. Building on your structural demographic theory, could the surge of populist movements across both developing and advanced democracies be viewed as pre-revolutionary signals of systemic stress? How does elite overproduction and the manipulation of anti-elite sentiment by insiders fit within your model of cyclical instability and regime decay?
Well, the structural demographic theory points to three major weaknesses or vulnerabilities that precipitate a revolutionary situation. One is government debt. That is, when government is unable to raise revenues because of resistance to taxation or economic difficulties, but expenses keep growing. And in the West, the aging of the population and the demand for retirement and healthcare and so on has kept expenses rising as the population's gotten older. Meanwhile, the population is not growing as fast as it used to. So the labor force is stagnating and tax revenues are stagnating. So we've seen Britain, France, Germany, the United States, China, all of these countries are dealing with problems of financing their government and growing government debt. So that's one major element that no one seems able to escape, because they can't find the rapid growth that would be necessary to balance the books against the growth in government spending that the populations demand. Plus, the rich are seeking more tax cuts for themselves wherever they can. So that's one element. Second element, what you mentioned, the overproduction of elites. This is something that's a little hard to understand, because it's not just that more people are becoming qualified for elite positions. During times of economic growth and population expansion, that can be a good thing. As long as there's a growing demand for more doctors, lawyers, accountants, financiers, engineers. After all, China blew its economy, 4 or 5-fold increases. Part of that was growing population, growing number of college graduates, growing number of engineers. Overproduction of elites occurs when you have a growth in the number of people who consider themselves entitled to elite positions, but the number of elite positions that society is providing starts to stagnate or decline. And that leads to kind of a pileup with more and more people hoping to obtain elite positions and unable to do so. So the visible sign of this is a sharp decline in social mobility. The number of people who are able to move from middle or working or lower class into upper class positions, that declines, because the number of upper class positions starts to stagnate, and those who are already in those positions try and protect that status for themselves and their families. So, for example, universities for much of the 1950s, 60s, even 1970s were engines of social mobility. People went to college, got degrees, were able to get white-collar jobs in government or finance or private sector, and we had sustained economic growth. But from the 80s and 90s, we start to see wealth becoming more concentrated. The universities, the elite universities, become what I call the elites universities. That is, it gets harder and harder for ordinary people to get into an elite university because you have to jump through these meritocratic hoops that are increasingly dominated by families that are already in the upper crust of the elite. So it's the decline of social mobility that's really the marker of overproduction of elites. And we see this everywhere. Japan, China, you have the hikikomori in Japan, you have the lie flat phenomenon in China. In Western Europe and in the United States, you have young people who are increasingly frustrated and angry that they're not seeing the kind of expected gains in quality of life and lifestyle that their parents enjoyed. And we have data for the United States that shows for cohorts that were born in the 1940s and 50s, their rate of social mobility was almost 85% plus. Whereas for the cohorts that were born in the 1990s, early 2000s, their rate of social mobility, that is earning a higher income in their 20s than their parents did, that's dropped below 50%. So now failure for mobility is becoming the expectation, and that has huge effects on people's sense of optimism for the future, confidence in government. It creates the kind of anger that fuels a revolutionary moment. And with the government continually burdened by excessive financial debt, there's not much the government can do to kind of expand employment or provide alternatives. So governments are in debt, elites are getting stacked up, and social mobility is declining. And then the third element is that the labor force grew with the baby boom. That was amplified by a big surge of immigration in the 60s and 70s, and then again in the 2000s. The result of all of that is that the wage structure has stratified. That is to say, at the high end, professionals have continued to enjoy rising wages, but for the non-college educated worker, especially non-college educated men, real wages have stagnated or even declined over the last 30 years. That creates the sense of popular grievances among a majority of the population that is taking their anger out on those dominant elites who are pulling up the ladder and reducing social mobility. So structural demographic theory, in a word, government debt, elite overproduction and excess competition, and popular grievances about their declining living standards and loss of opportunity. You put those three together, you have a collapse of faith in the existing government and institutions. That creates a revolutionary situation that can be exploited by leaders who want to lead who want to lead a group of people who are interested in blowing everything up. People who are angry, frustrated, feel the government is not working in their interests, hasn't done so for a while, and if they don't create a dramatic change, they see their situation as only getting worse. That's a revolutionary moment.
Right. You have warned that unregulated social media floods the zone with disinformation, eroding democratic consensus. How the emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence and algorithmic content creation, reshape the conditions for mobilization and revolution? Do these tools empower new forms of collective agency or primarily strengthen authoritarian regimes' capacity for control and preemption?
Well, any new communications method, whether it was the printing press, radio, television, now the internet, is going to set off a struggle between popular groups and the government to see who can control that media more effectively to create and empower communities. So, in the beginning, radio and TV were claimed to be great opportunities for popular education and strengthening democracy. But of course, whether it was in Germany with radio, in the Soviet Union with television, governments figured out how to use those media and turn them into arms of propaganda. This, of course, happened even earlier with print censorship and government taking over the government-owned publications. So wherever you see the government controlling media, whether it's newspapers or radio or television, it's likely to become an outlet for propaganda. Now, the idea behind the internet was, oh, everybody can publish. There's no way the government can take over the internet. Bill Clinton famously said, China wants to run the internet. It'll be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, the Chinese figured out how to use staples and glue guns. And basically, they managed to take control of the internet by creating their own workforce and bots, so that if something comes up on the internet that the Chinese authorities dislike, they don't try to shut it down. They realize that leads to backlash, and that's obvious. Instead, they tell all of their workers to set up bots and their own personal statements on the internet and flood social media with contradictory or countermanding stories. So whatever the original true story or complaint was, it gets barraged with contradictory stories that try and pull it apart or counter it. And it's very hard for the truth to emerge if there is no established source of truth that people believe. Instead of having one or two major networks or one or two major print publications, we now have thousands. Everybody has their own podcast, internet channel. People can say whatever they like. It's totally unregulated now. So anybody can lie and have those lies widely distributed. The president of the United States can tell lies. He can issue lies on his White House web, Truth, ironically named Truth Social. So it's kind of like, the Soviet Union had Pravda as its flagship publication, Truth, and the United States has Truth Social today as the flagship for whatever stories the president wants to tell. The fact that AI can now fabricate visuals and stories at zero marginal cost for huge saturation, that's part of the problem. But part of the problem also is the internet simply allows so many channels, so many different ways to insert misinformation into the space. Now, people originally said, oh, the internet's going to be great for mobilizing people to resist government. It'll be a tool of democracy because you can't stop it from people communicating with each other. Well, again, communications to mobilize groups can also be weakened by a flood of false information. And even if the internet can build communities of resistance, it doesn't give them the flesh and blood power of courage and resistance to authority that bonds of community or neighborhood or religion do. So if you want to see effective resistance to authoritarian regimes, it still comes from community bonds, not just from internet chat groups. Where the internet is really dangerous, in my view, is that it distorts reality. It makes it hard for people to be certain of what is true and what is not, and therefore undermines building a common base that people can use to say, this is the truth we have to defend. This is the outcome we all want to work for. If that gets broken up into competing pieces and people are not sure, you get complacency, passivity, anxiety. That's what I worry about the social media world providing. I think people will overcome it, just as we're rebuilding human bonds in schools by the rule that says students have to leave their cell phones in a locker during the school day. So for the 8 hours of the school day, they have to deal with friends. They have to play real sports. They have to read real books. They have to talk to each other. That's a big improvement. And I think we're going to see people have a hunger for that genuine connection. But for the last 10 or 15 years, I think we've seen real personal connections, real bonds, and confidence about the truth be significantly diminished by the spread of easy access to social media. But I don't think that's permanent.
Right. In the paradox of victory, you describe how movements that achieve short-term success often fail to institutionalize durable change. Could the Arab Spring, Occupy, and various anti-establishment populist movements exemplify this paradox, where mobilization terms are followed by democratic aggression or authoritarian backlash? What determines whether such movements yield reform or re-entrenchment?
Well, we've had kind of a wild swings back and forth in lots of policy domains. And I think that's because we've become so polarized. And again, we meaning the West, United States, Europe, even Japan. You look at governments, instead of the opposing parties trying to hammer out compromises that can be the basis for broad agreement going forward, you have factions trying to win narrow triumphs in which they kind of ram their view down the throat of the opposition and say, we're in power now, so we're going to pass this law or promulgate this policy. The problem with that is as soon as power shifts and the other faction is in control, they say, oh, we're going to repeal everything that our opponents did, and we're going to push our own rules and laws. But that doesn't become lasting either, because they failed to achieve a broad consensus underlying that. You know, in the United States, if we look back at the transformative actions of the 1960s, building the Great Society, building the Civil Rights Movement, at that time, leaders tried to bring on board a broad coalition and different actors. So Social Security was not presented as a socialist style welfare state. Social Security in the United States, that is pension payments to seniors, that's what we call, Social Security is what we call our pension payments. Social Security was presented as something that individuals earned by their contributions. So what other countries saw as a welfare state, American politicians presented as just a fair return to an individual's own efforts at work. That created really broad consent, so much so that people now consider Social Security payments as a basic right of American citizens. But those same people will say, but we reject the welfare state, we reject socialism, but Social Security, that's something that I earned. It's a matter of how it was presented in order to build a broad compromise, a broad coalition and base. But if you look at other things, healthcare, Obamacare was kind of a narrow Democratic victory, and the Republicans have been trying to tear it down ever since. Affirmative action did have a broad support base for a while, let's say 3 or 4 decades, although affirmative action was more accepted in the area of housing. That is, people could see, yeah, we shouldn't discriminate on housing, but school integration, especially when it involved busing students far from their homes, that was never accepted. And so affirmative action has kind of always been on the margin, where we never really accepted the need in America to create broad justice for minorities. It was always, well, we should do a little bit here to help this group, or we should do a little bit there to help that group. And that has now become deeply unpopular, so much so that most of affirmative action has been or is being rolled back. Now, this policy instability is not good. It's hard for people to plan for the future if policy will change radically every 4, 6, or 8 years. It's hard for business, it's hard for people. And you lose confidence in government if government is nothing more than a football that's kicked back and forth between 2 opposing teams. Makes it look like each team is just in it for themselves. Who's watching out for me? Who's watching out for the ordinary citizen? If government doesn't have a widely accepted set of plans and goals to lift everybody up, then what's the purpose of it? It just becomes my faction or your faction. So when I say the paradox of victory, what I mean is you can win something by a narrow margin in the short term, but narrow margin short-term victories tend to turn into long-term failures for society as a whole, because there's no stability, no sense of agreement and shared values, just more polarization and worse fights that are brought by that kind of series of one narrow margin short-term victory after another, each overturning what happened before and creating really insecurity, uncertainty, and chaos. It brings things down despite people feeling good about, oh, this year we had a victory. But that's not a victory for society.
Right. In the Handbook of Revolutions in the 21st Century, you identify global capitalism and corrupt elites as key drivers of revolutionary pressure. How do you interpret the global resurgence of state capitalism from China's digital authoritarianism to Western neo-industrialism as both a mechanism for managing inequality and a source of renewed instability within the international political economy?
Well, in general, I am a supporter, an enthusiastic supporter for capitalism. By that, I mean there's no better way than free market competition and a price mechanism for encouraging enterprise and for rewarding effort. That is to say, as long as the rules of the game encourage competition, fair dealing, open information, and open opportunity, capitalism can be effective in promoting social mobility, economic growth, higher productivity, and innovation. But as we all know, capitalism is also prone to control by monopolies and oligopolies. And when oligopolies and monopolies start to take control, when elites monopolize the elite positions in society, you don't get those benefits for the average person. You get growing inequality, less social mobility, more difficulties for the average worker, and greater political and economic influence for those who have seized control of the largest corporations and the main financial institutions. So I'm in favor of capitalism, but if capitalism becomes too unregulated and allows too much concentration of wealth and economic power, then it tends to lead to a revolutionary situation because of the anger and frustration of those who feel they're being left behind. I think during the Cold War, capitalist countries were on the defensive, and capitalist elites tolerated a higher level of taxation on the rich. They tolerated stronger unions. All of that was seen as necessary to kind of respond to the challenge of communism, which promised a workers' paradise and promised to put workers first. The response to communism since the 19th century has always been to give workers better wages, greater benefits, more opportunities. But after the Cold War, when communism seemed to be vanquished and gone, capitalism was kind of unleashed. It was like, hey, we've won this fight. Capitalism is clearly the better way to go, so let it rip. And, let globalization take over. Let the market do its thing. Profits are good. Greed is good. Let's do away with workers' combinations and unions that seem to be obstacles. Let's reduce government regulation. And what did that bring us? That brought us the speculative bubble of the dot-com boom. It brought us the unrestrained credit debacle that led to the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, which devastated small homeowners. And those two crises showed that letting capitalism rip simply leads to instability, wealth concentration, periodic crises. You look at the United States today, the economy seems to be doing well, but more than half of all private consumption is by just the top 20% of consumers by income. What we're seeing is progress in taller penthouses, bigger yachts, greater private art collections, but we're not seeing more investment in public parks, public education, public health is under threat. Things that help the ordinary citizen get security are being weakened, whereas things that help the very rich get even richer are being strengthened. So at that point, capitalism goes from being a wonderful thing to something that's actually undermining the social bonds, the confidence, the optimism, and the shared values that underlie social cohesion and a well-functioning democracy. That's why I think so many of today's democracies are in a revolutionary situation that's opening the way for authoritarian leaders. We kind of let capitalism go too far in the direction of concentration of wealth. That's normal, but I think it always has to be regulated to some degree.
Right. And lastly, Professor Goldstone, your comparative work on historical state crises suggests that revolutionary waves accompany periods of hegemonic decline. Does the erosion of the liberal rule-based order through geopolitical fragmentation, trade nationalism, and elite polarization mark the onset of a new world systemic revolutionary cycle comparable to those surrounding 1789, 1848, or 1917?
Yeah, I think they do. I think there's no question that today we are in a worldwide pattern of ethno-nationalist populism. It's already triumphed in Russia and China, where there's a very strong emphasis on national identity, ethnic identity as the basis for national cohesion. And that national ethnic identity is embodied by a strong leader, whether it's Putin, Xi Jinping. That pattern was seen as the antithesis of Western democratic values, but actually turned out just to be kind of the leading edge of a global ethno-nationalist authoritarian movement. We see this with the rise of anti-immigration parties. They've taken power in Hungary, briefly in Poland. They're becoming a larger part of the coalitions across European countries. And clearly in the United States, we now have a government that is willing to enact authoritarian measures against foreigners, against immigrants if they are suspected of being illegal. We're bombing fishing boats on the high seas in an act of war to protect our borders from drugs. But the motivating idea now behind the American government is the America First, America for Americans. There's even a movement to end birthright citizenship and say that you can't just be born on American territory, you have to be born of American citizens. I don't know if that will become law or not. It has never been the case. But the fact that we have a government now that is pursuing that as a goal, restricting citizenship, becoming more hostile to foreigners, becoming very harshly militarized against suspected illegal immigrants. I just think that all shows we're in a worldwide wave of ethno-nationalist populism that has gained power because of the ineffectiveness, turmoil, and collapse of trust in democratic institutions. Now, you say, is this like other waves of revolution? Yes, and all waves of revolution eventually are succeeded by a period of consolidation, but then often change. So the French Revolution went through phases of republican, authoritarian, Napoleonic Empire, even the restoration of the monarchy. But then in another couple of decades, there was another revolution to promote constitutional rule. And French government eventually, after several cycles, did settle down to democracy after 1870. All across Europe in the 1930s, you had ethno-nationalist authoritarian leaders. This was true of East German states, Germany, of course, and then all of the countries that Germany conquered. There were a few exceptions, but for the most part, most of Europe was given over to dictatorship and ethno-nationalist ideology. After World War II, that reversed. Now, we're in another wave that reminds me very much of the 1930s. Weak democracies accused of being corrupt, elites being attacked, and very popular strongman authoritarian leaders coming to the fore while mainstream parties are cast aside. You know, the mainstream parties failed in France. Right now, Labour looks very weak in Britain. Even after winning a huge majority, they seem ineffective. The ethno-nationalist British Reform Party looks like it's gaining strength. In France, it looks like National Alliance will be effective. So we have a global, worldwide populist authoritarian movement. And they're aware of it. I mean, all of these authoritarian leaders, they hang out at CPAC, they share notes, they encourage each other, they actively support each other in their quest to create ethno-nationalist authoritarian states. I'm worried that the 2020s will look like the 1930s in that regard. And as I say, there may be wars as a result of this. I don't rule out the possibility that America and China may go to war over Taiwan. We already see this endless war in Ukraine. I don't know where others may break out, but ethno-nationalism tends to breed conflict because by its nature, it's exclusionary and often hostile. So I expect the next 10 years probably to be very difficult, but I am hopeful that from the late 2030s forward, we will see the next generation of young people demanding more accountability, more freedom, wanting to use new technologies to build a better world for themselves. So I remain optimistic in the long run, even though pessimistic, unfortunately, for the next 5 to 10 years.
Professor Jack Goldstone, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
You put a lot into a half hour, so thank you for keeping me on schedule.
Thank you.